Hello, my name's Chris Roberts. Welcome to The Long Road. We're going to have kind of a short show today. Unfortunately, I have to go to a funeral. My brother-in-law passed last week, and so the funeral's today. And so that's more important than doing a fully live television show. One important thing of note is that the Dr. Seuss breakfast at the Keene Kitchen this Saturday, from 8 to 11:30, $3 for children, $7 for adults. I've gone a couple of times in the past, and it's a really good event. The children like it, and they do a really great job. The first clip that I'm going to show you is going to be about 25 minutes. It's going to be with Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. It was from a conference I went to, and you're going to see this man, how emotional he gets about giving a quality education to our children. And I think it's extremely important before the school board election to understand what we want from education. I really respect this man, and I think he has some really good ideas. The last clip is going to be, it's an old clip from 1965, and it goes, what's the color of black? What is black? And this will be the last one for Black History Month. And again, I think you'll find this quite enlightening and somewhat enjoyable. I've slipped in PSA clip concerning homeless people, and it's about 2 minutes. I think it's just an eye-opener. And because, as I said before, we have homelessness all over the place, and far too many. We have a lot of homelessness in Keene, not just the people that go to the 100-night shelter, but we have families, we have children, we have more and more children homeless. And so it's something that we need to be discussing. It's something that the governor should be putting more money into. And we'll see what happens when this budget comes up. And so, again, we're getting closer to the school board elections. I think there's 9 people right now. Well, I think 1 has dropped out. And whether you vote for me or vote for anybody else, the idea is I rather have you go out there and vote for the person of your choice. It's really important. It's extremely important that you go out and vote. And so, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the clips.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker this morning, Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. As you all know, Secretary Duncan is our 9th U.S. Secretary of Education, and under his leadership, he has spearheaded numerous innovative and creative initiatives at the department, such as Race to the Top. He set the tone for his tenure during his confirmation hearings when he called education, quote, the most pressing problem, the most pressing issue facing America today, and added that preparing young people for success is not just a moral obligation, but an economic imperative. I've had the opportunity personally to work directly with Secretary Duncan and his team on our Univision National Education Initiative that's focused on the Hispanic community, and I can tell you from seeing this firsthand that the passion for education reform, particularly with minority communities, is something that is in Arne Duncan's DNA. You know, prior to his current position from 2001 to 2008, he was the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, and while there, he won high praise from many for bringing reform leaders together, principals, teachers, and business leaders behind an aggressive reform agenda. A native of Chicago, a graduate of Harvard University, and a former professional basketball player that rumor says he can still hold his own on the court. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Caesar, for that kind introduction. To the many friends here and governors, thank you for your leadership. I want much rather have a conversation than a long lecture, so I'll just say a couple things and look forward to your questions. And obviously, when I said yes to this invitation, I didn't know if we would still, still have a job or not. So I'm thrilled to have the chance to keep doing this work with many of you, hopefully for the next 4 years. It's just an amazing, amazing opportunity that a few years ago I couldn't have begun to dream possible. But just to sort of let you know what I'm thinking about, and obviously a time over the next couple months to really try and think about what we want to do over the next 4 years. And I'm challenging my team to try and be extraordinarily ambitious. And we've made some progress over the past 4 years, but we know as we look across the country at a high school dropout rate that's 25%, at a college graduation rate where we're 14th in the world, at as many as 2 million high-wage, high-skilled jobs today in this country in tough economic times that go unfilled. This is not a time to be resting on our laurels or congratulating ourselves. We have so much unfinished business, and that's why all of you are in this room. So how do we think about that? Where do we try and go as we move forward? A couple different areas I'll just walk through quickly. I've been thrilled the past couple years to focus on early childhood education. I think that's arguably the best investment we can make. We want to continue to try and stay the course there. I'm just tired at every level in education that we're constantly playing catch up. I keep saying we have to get out of the catch up business. And the best way I can think for us to get out of the catch up business is to have our 5-year-olds entering kindergarten ready to succeed, ready to read with their literacy and socialization skills intact. And we want to continue to work very, very hard to create more opportunities there, particularly in disadvantaged communities where too many of our children come to kindergarten today not knowing the front of the book from the back of the book. That presents just an extraordinary challenge to the best of kindergarten teachers, and that reality has to change. On the K-12 side, obviously we've seen an amazing amount of reform, but everyone here knows these next couple years are years of huge challenge. The idea of implementing higher standards, the adoption of 46 states of higher standards is clearly a huge step in the right direction. That's the easy part. How we teach those higher standards, how we help teachers and principals in the community and parents, and most importantly, students themselves, understand what it takes to hit that higher bar. How do political leaders have the courage when their test scores drop 20, 30, 40, 50%, and we stop lying to children, we tell the truth? Will they have the courage not to backpedal and dummy down standards as so many political leaders did under No Child Left Behind? We have to work very hard on that. As we move forward with teacher and principal evaluation and support that is meaningful and it takes into account for the first time, maybe in decades, actual student achievement. Do we have the courage to stay the course there? So we think through the next generation of assessments. I know you had a presentation, I think, yesterday on the 2 consortia states working so hard on that. All these things are great, but the confluence of them over the next couple of years, let me promise you, is going to be hard and choppy and difficult. And we can either choose to sort of backpedal and run from those challenges and run from things when they're not exactly perfect, or we can stay the course. If we stay the course, 3, 4 years from now, I think we would have moved our country forward in just an absolutely remarkable direction. But we do run a risk for a whole host of reasons of backpedaling. If we lose this moment of opportunity, I don't know when we get it back again. We'll have to think through together how we make sure we have the courage to do the right thing there. I also continue to challenge myself to think about how we attract and retain great talent into education. We know we have the baby boomers retiring. The need for great talent has never been greater. There's nothing more important than getting a great teacher into every classroom, a great principal into every school. But it's really interesting to me as we all talk about the achievement gap, as I look across 15,000 school districts in this country. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. We do not have one school district that I'm aware of that systemically identifies their highest performers, their best principals, their hardest working teachers, and systemically puts them with the most underserved children. And in fact, we have so many disincentives for the greatest talent to go to where the greatest need is. And I'm sort of tired of talking about the achievement gap, and I continue to talk now about the opportunity gap. And I just think as a country, for all of our seeming intent or seeming courage, we have been spectacularly uncourageous in this effort. And if we're serious about closing achievement gaps, we have to close the opportunity gap. And I'm looking for a series of, ideally states, but maybe start at the district level, who are on a systemic level going to find their hardest working, their most committed human capital, their talent, and place it with the children who need the most help. There are a couple places that are tinkering with this around the edges, but the fact that we don't have one that is doing this out of 15,000 shows to me that, again, we're not even in the game. We're not there yet, and need to continue to think very, very hard about that. And then finally, all of this is to what end? The president has challenged me, and I hold myself accountable, to help us lead the world again in college graduation rates. And the fact that we're 14th should be something that is just absolutely unacceptable to all of us. We have to make sure college continues to be accessible and affordable. Probably many of you in this room are struggling to pay for college, and when I'm on our airplane yesterday, or whether I'm in the dry cleaners or the grocery store, I can't tell you how many not just disadvantaged families, but middle-class families come up, and the cost of college is just crushing them. And how we make that dream of going to college more accessible, more affordable for folks who are working hard and doing all the right things. We've taken some significant steps with a $40 billion increase in Pell Grants, but we have not begun to solve this problem. How we work on access and affordability, not just on the front end, how we work on completion rates. The goal is not to go to college, the goal is to graduate at the back end. Attainment rates are nowhere near where we need to be. How we push in that very hard. And then finally, how we think about community colleges, which I think are just such a huge part of the solution here. And as folks retrain and retool for the new economy, green energy jobs and IT jobs and healthcare jobs and advanced manufacturing jobs, we want to continue to shine a spotlight on the great work that community colleges can do to help families and communities and ultimately the country get back on its feet. So an ambitious agenda, a long, long way to go, but I just so appreciate the bipartisan leadership of folks coming together. I continue to say we have to put politics and ideology to the side. I see great leadership coming from the states and things like the waivers and other opportunities. My hope is that Congress will start to work in a more bipartisan way and getting through the fiscal cliff, not having sequestration happen, thinking about reauthorizing No Child Left Behind together. If folks want to come together, I can't think of a better area to work on than education. I think it's clearly in Congress's self-interest to do something in a very different way, and we hope that opportunity comes. But the real work is always going to come at the local level, in communities, in districts and states. Your leadership is hugely important, and please hold me and my team accountable for being a great partner as we try and help lead the country where we need to go. Thank you so much. I'll stop there. I'm happy to take some questions.
Hi, I'm Andy Rotherham. I was asked to come up and ask the Secretary a couple of questions and then open up the audience. So I think I'll start with the obvious one that everyone wants to know. We all read Tom Friedman, so that was an interesting education agenda. But what are your plans as Secretary of State?
That was Tom Friedman this morning. Last week, The Onion said I was going to become a male stripper, so I don't know which one's more. The Onion's probably more accurate than Tom Friedman, but no, I've clearly more than enough to keep me busy and occupied. I would love to have the opportunity to keep doing the job I currently have.
Well, you alluded to something, and you said, politics is going to get more treacherous, these things. I want to talk about that more directly, because, traditionally, and this is an interesting conference for it, the center on education has not really held over time. It didn't hold for the first President Bush. It didn't hold for President Clinton when he proposed some of these things. We've always had to walk them back, and we've seen what's happened with No Child Left Behind and the second President Bush. We look up, we get to this accountability cliff, we look over it, and we tend to back away. No Child Left Behind said 40% of schools in the country need to do better, and people said, whoa, that's a lot, maybe that's too many. So looking ahead at the politics, it's a second term, and so there's politics associated with that. There's a midterm election. Reform didn't have a great night on election night this year. There was some pushback on a number of initiatives supported by many people in this room. Politically, what's going to make it different this time that we're not going to sort of see history repeat itself?
Well, I'm actually extraordinarily hopeful, and I don't think it's a naive hope, and some might argue that it is. But when I look at what states, again, Congress has been a little more difficult. When I look at what states and governors and local legislative leaders and state school chief officers, what they have done over the past couple years, Andy, no one predicted that would happen. No one predicted that 46 states would adopt higher standards. No one would have predicted that three dozen states have taken teacher evaluation and principal support to a very different level. No one would have predicted that we have 44 states working on the next generation of assessments. And the fact, frankly, that we've had almost no rollback there. And honestly, if a couple states choose to roll back, that would not be the end of the world. The media would find that fascinating. But to look at where we were 3 or 4 years ago compared to today, I have seen amazing courage, amazing leadership at the state level, and that makes me hopeful about where we can go.
So Cesar introduced you. This election, I think one of the big things that came out of it, obviously, if you look at the demographics of the electorate, is the Republican Party is struggling mightily with Hispanic voters and is in some ways going the wrong way. Substantively, education struggles with Hispanic youth. The outcomes are dreadful, particularly for kids who English isn't their first language or immigrant children, but overall, enormous achievement gaps. In the second term specifically, as this issue tends, I think, fortunately and thankfully, is going to move more to the forefront, what are the kinds of things you're thinking about for this group of students?
So a couple things. Obviously, I think there's a moment of opportunity on both sides, and again, some soul searching on maybe more on the Republican side. That we have to do something around immigration reform. And of all the things I'm proud of, one of my biggest disappointments from the first 4 years is that we didn't get the DREAM Act passed. I just think we are absolutely crazy on that as a country. And the fact that we allow so many children who have worked so hard and played by the rules and gotten great grades and been community leaders, the fact that we slam shut the door of opportunity is absolutely insane. And this isn't the right thing just to do for the Hispanic community. This is the right thing to do for our country. These are the future leaders, job creators, entrepreneurs, innovators. And so I think there is a moment of opportunity literally now, in these next couple months, for Congress to do the right thing. And if that happens, clearly the upside there is just absolutely extraordinary. The other thing you may not know of, just in the past 2 years, we've seen a 25% increase in Hispanic enrollment in college. That is a huge jump. Now we got to make sure, again, it's not just enrollment, it's graduation rates at the back end. But I think there's a growing awareness. The college going rates are up, high school dropout rates are down, high school graduation rates are up. Long way to go. Cesar and others have provided great leadership here. But again, there's a lot to be hopeful about, a lot to be optimistic about, and I think we have an opportunity together with the DREAM Act, something like the DREAM Act passing, to transform educational opportunity for the community.
Terrific. I know we have some questions from the audience, so the mic runners will start to come around. So quick lightning round question. Mr. Secretary, there's been a lot of talk about social mobility. Governor Bush gave a speech yesterday. More precisely, I would say the lack thereof, the profound lack thereof that we have. Just very specifically, lots of views ascribed to you on how you think about this and so forth. In your own words, just very briefly, what's the role specifically, not all the other factors involved in poverty, which is very complicated, mobility, but schools specifically, what's the role that elementary and secondary schools play in this problem of income inequality and social mobility?
Obviously, as you know, I spent my entire life working in the inner city in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. And what I've seen from the time I was a baby growing up as a part of my mother's program was the only way to break cycles of poverty is through educational opportunity. And I'm convinced, and not everyone will agree with me, that as a country, the dividing line to me is less around race and class than it is around educational opportunity. And you give me the poorest kid from the most violent neighborhood and the toughest family, put them in a great early childhood program, put them in an elementary school where they can take algebra in 8th grade and where they're great teachers, put them in a high school where they're getting the support academically and socially to think about going to college. And I'm actually really optimistic about that young person's future. Put that same child in a school with a 60% dropout rate and have them enter kindergarten never having seen a book, that we're just perpetuating the problem. So there's nothing more important we can do than provide great educational opportunities. And I'll always be the first to say, we got to feed children, we have to give them eyeglasses, we have to take care of their physical and social and emotional health, and a great teacher can't do this by themselves, but you can't get the success without great schools. It is absolutely fundamental, critical to helping break cycles of poverty and social failure.
All right, let's bring in some questions. And we'd ask, so we can get to a few questions, to keep them more in the traditional sort of interrogative sense of the question rather than the often Washington style of the more expository.
Secretary, how are you?
Great to see you, Mike.
Good to see you. I just wanted to report, as state superintendent in Michigan, I go to conferences and people treat you nice, but I want to say that being here yesterday, starting with Governor Bush, everyone praised you, even when you weren't here. It was really good to see. And by the way, so you don't get too big ahead, this basketball thing, I actually saw Justin Bieber in the celebrity game score on you, so this is it. But can I ask?
All right, Mike, we told the Secretary there'd be no really hard questions, so I'd ask you to please honor that.
Okay, so the specific question, we have a lot of discussion yesterday about the schools of education and how they can help us get better teachers. Do you have specific leverage points that you plan to use in the second term to that end?
Yeah, and it's an area where, again, I would give me and my team a low grade on the first term, and we've talked about it. But without getting too specific, there are a number of things that we are planning to do. At the end of the day, schools of education, not all, but many have been a part of the problem. And when I talk to great young teachers, the lack of actual classroom teaching experience, lots of theory of education, psychology of education, history of education, not enough actual education in diverse school settings. And then the lack of technology. And all these great young teachers are using formative assessments and figuring it out, but they're learning that in the job. They're asking why aren't they learning that when they're in school. So we need to push very, very hard with schools of ed. And just as we've had charter schools and other things to create innovation on the K-12 side, we need to look at alternative modes of teacher training as well to create some competitive pressure there as well. So that's part of a litany of unfinished business that we need to take very, very seriously.
Yes, ma'am, in the back. I saw a hand and a mic in the back. Here we go.
Thank you, Secretary. Again, I'd like to say really appreciate your commitment to providing great teachers for kids who are in underperforming schools and underperforming populations. I would like to ask you, though, as well, I hear so often, as we talk about being a leader in innovation in the next century, I've heard folks say in different settings from time to time that the high-performing kids will kind of take care of themselves, and that we don't need to focus as much on them. I would submit if we're going to be great as a nation in the next century, both in innovation and otherwise, we need to have a strategy around the Thomas Jeffersons and the Bill Gates of the world to make sure that the top-performing kids are really being challenged to be all they can be as well. Is there a focus within your department in any way on those top-performing kids to really kind of take them to the next level as well, so that we're focusing not just on the poor-performing kids, not just on raising the center from a 1,000 SAT to a 1,200 SAT, but those top kids as well, making them be all they can be.
Yeah. These are all great questions that deserve longer answers, but I think part of what so disturbed me under the traditional accountability and No Child Left Behind is there was a focus on that proficiency cut score right in the middle. So there's lots of incentives to work with those 5% of kids around the middle to try and bump them over that bar and look like you were doing something, and no incentives to help those kids at the top or at the bottom. So for me, it's not about the top or the bottom in the middle, it's about all kids. And for me, I want to look at growth and gain. How much are kids improving? Again, what we see coming from states to the waiver process is pretty extraordinary. So whether it's that extraordinarily gifted child, or whether it's that child in the middle, or whether it's that child with special needs, I want to know how much those children are improving each year. And where you incentivize teachers and schools and districts and ultimately states to be accountable for the growth, for the improvement of every single child, then I think you get away from the disincentives that I think the federal law put in place. So it's not for me about targeting any one population, but it's saying that in any class, in any school, you have that whole spectrum. We have to get away from focusing on a small number. We have to figure out how we're individualizing, how we're personalizing instruction with great teachers, with technology, with a whole set of things during the school day and after school to make sure that children are reaching their academic and social potential. The thing, a little bit off topic, I just want to add that Paul Tuff's work on the non-cognitive skills I just think is hugely important as well. And it's not just about the academic piece of this. And I think so much about the kids I worked with growing up, that academic part was important, but the resiliency and the grit and the determination and the ability to overcome obstacles is something I think all of us have to take much more seriously, and it's hugely important if we're serious about having kids achieve things that no one in their family has ever done before.
Let me ask a quick follow-up on that before we go to another question. So we're talking about progress and growth, but the assessment consortia are wrestling with what those are going to look like. Very specifically, will you consider it a failure if the assessment consortia don't come up with a common cut score that all states that are participating use on those assessments? Will you consider that a failure of that initiative?
I think you need to, again, they have some work to do, and we want to support them in being successful in getting across the finish line. And obviously part of the reason we funded two rather than one was to create some competition between states and sort of see what makes sense. So this thing will play for a couple years, and it would have been easier for us to fund one, but we didn't think anyone necessarily had the perfect answer. But I think to have comparability between the two so that we can have those honest conversations is going to be an important piece of the puzzle. But again, that's just one piece. I don't want to oversimplify the thing.
Yes, ma'am.
Senator Jane Cunningham from Missouri, thank you so much, Secretary, for the reforms that you have brought and the way you've challenged states to meet those reforms. Last night we heard from Condoleezza Rice and Joel Klein, and they gave us a report on their report on from the Council on Foreign Relations. And they told us that we are at a stage as far as national security risk because of education that we can't have an evolution of education and wait for us to get where we need to be with improvement, but that we really need to do it very, very quickly like a revolution. They got the question, if you could do one thing to reach that revolution, to get the improvement that we need right away to deal with the national security risk, what would it be? They both had the same answer, choice and competition. including all options, open enrollment, charters, non-public schools. And I guess I ask you that, what you would recommend and how you all might be challenging the states to open those options. In Missouri, we have 2 districts, more than that, but at least 2 big ones, Kansas City and St. Louis, that are highly underperforming. And the public school districts around them, especially in the St. Louis area, will not accept those children and give them an opportunity like you had talked about. Yet our parochial schools in the St. Louis area would open their doors wide and welcome.
Okay, I want to make sure we can get to, so Arnie, let's, Mr. Secretary, answer this specifically, the question on choice, or the one thing.
So I always sort of push back against the one thing because I think part of our challenge in education is we've looked for silver bullets. This is really hard, complex work, so I always want to go back to early childhood opportunity and K-12 reform and higher ed. But if there's one thing, and again, I don't want to, I don't think there's one thing. When I look at the highest performing countries across the globe, Singapore and South Korea and Finland, what they have in common is that 100% of their teachers come from the top third of their graduating classes. In several of those countries, 100% of their teachers come from the top 10% of their graduating classes. So 90% of folks who want to enter education don't have the opportunity. Today, 2/3 of our teachers come from the bottom third of their graduating classes. And we talk about 1 million teachers retiring, 1/3 of the workforce. The opportunity for us to attract and retain great talent now is going to change public education for the next 30 years. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And so if there's one thing I could do, it's how we elevate and strengthen the teaching profession. We've talked a lot about this Respect initiative. There's a lot of information on our website. But that's maybe the biggest gift that we could give to this country.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Superintendent John Huppenthal from Arizona. Secretary, can you talk about your performance pay initiatives and what successes you see there and what challenges you see there?
Yeah, and again, let's be really clear, there's no silver bullet, so I don't want to act like merit pay is the one way to do it, but I just fundamentally think, and I've been very public in this, that great teachers, great principals should make a heck of a lot more money than they make today. And no one enters education to make $1 million, but you shouldn't have to take a vow of poverty either. And when I go out to colleges and talk, and a lot of folks say they have a heart and a passion for education, but they can't afford it, and I say, what if you were a great teacher, 30, 32, and you could make $100,000 a year? And those college kids get real quiet and sit up. That gets their attention. And what if you're a great principal and you can make $150,000, $170,000, $200,000? You pick a number. That's the best investment we can make. And where you have hard-to-staff subjects like math and science, we've had a shortage of math and science teachers for 30 years. Again, we can keep admiring the problem, or we can fix that shortage. The final thing I'll say is, again, go back to where I started, I've yet to find a district that systemically puts their best talent in the underserved communities. And money is never going to be the reason why they do that, but it's a piece of a whole host of things. The opportunity to make a difference, the opportunity to be part of a transformative team. Those folks going to inner city urban areas or rural or Native American reservations need to have as part of their incentive package significantly more money. I was on one Native American reservation not too long ago where half their teachers come from the Philippines because they can't find a teacher from America to go work there. Something's wrong with that picture.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. It was a nice moment there. You don't usually get to give your vow of poverty talking point when there's an actual nun right in the front row. Speaks well to this audience. Thank you so much for coming, though. Thank you for taking questions, both from me and from the
One of the severest problems in the South is brutality practiced by law enforcement officers, such as an incident that occurred to me about a year and a half ago in Plaquemine, Louisiana. It was there that I had been in jail at the time of the March on Washington and was unable to be in Washington at that historic march. After getting out of jail in Plaquemine, Louisiana, I was confronted with a lynch mob, a most unusual lynch mob. It was composed of state law enforcement officers, state troopers, who were riding horseback, roaming through the streets, kicking open doors in the Negro community and screaming for my blood, screaming, "Come on out." They tear-gassed a church in which 200 or 300 people were congregated. I was in that church. We were forced out of the church by tear gas into a parsonage, the minister's home next door, and from there we were forced into the yard by tear gas, and from the yard back into the parsonage and back into the yard. If any Negro was seen in the street during that night in Plaquemine, Louisiana, he was run down by state troopers, beaten with a club, and stuck with an electric cattle prod, told to get up and run, then run down again and told that they would let him go if he would tell them where I was. We finally managed to escape into a funeral home a half block away by crawling through tall grass. We got to the funeral home, but there was no respite there. The state troopers soon kicked open the back door of that place, still screaming for my blood. Finally, I managed to escape, but only after using 2 hearses, one as a decoy and the other with me in it. The decoy was used to pull state troopers away from the roadblocks that they had set up, and it worked. I was then put in the back of the second hearse and sped toward New Orleans, where we held a press conference and described what had transpired and announced that I was returning to Plaquemine the next day, and if the state troopers had a warrant for my arrest, I would be there to be served with it and to find out what the charges were. The next day, we discovered that they had no warrant at all.
That is James Farmer, a gentleman who should know about racial relations in the southern United States. Mr. Farmer is the head of the Congress of Racial Equality in the United States, and a gentleman who has probably been in jail because of his actions more than any of us will ever think of being in jail. Tonight, Channel 12 Special is going to talk to Mr. Farmer about some of the real issues in the fight for equality in the United States. How many times have you been in jail, or can you tell us?
Oh, I've been in about 8 or 9 different jails on 4 arrests. In Mississippi, I was placed in 4 different jails, including the state penitentiary at Parchman, the maximum security unit. In Louisiana, I was in 2 different jails and in 3 different jails in New York City at the time of the opening of the World's Fair.
Now, you've been in Selma recently, and you were there at the time of the heightened tensions.
Yes.
How does Selma differ from any other small white community in the South, or small community in the South?
Well, Selma has more Negroes than it has white. This is one of the distinguishing features. There are such towns as Selma and such counties throughout the Deep South. But it's also a very poor town. The industries that are there are on their last legs, as it were, and unemployment is very great. And one usually finds that when unemployment is great in any area, the racial tensions tend to heighten.
We've heard considerable about outside agitators. People, well, Governor Wallace has talked about if the outside agitators would stay out, our people are happy, the Negroes here are happy. What about this?
Well, nothing could be further from the truth. It may be that Governor Wallace really believes that he has been conditioned to believe that Negroes are happy or content, but they are not happy under segregation, and they do not need outsiders to tell them that they are not happy. They realize it. All that they do with the outside persons representing the civil rights organizations is to use them for the specialized skills that they have. Now, in Mississippi, they tell me that the state was gravely concerned about its public image when the Freedom Riders first went into the state in 1961 and hired a public relations firm to try to correct that image. The public relations firm sent 2 of its brightest young men down there. They studied the situation and came up with a plan of action. They would put one Negro on television and let him tell all the American people how happy Negroes are in Mississippi and how they love segregation and how good the white people treat them. They sat him down in the studio and told him that people all over the country were watching his face and would be listening to his voice, and he should tell them that. He said, just a minute, I have a question to ask. Did you say they can hear me all over the country? In New York and Washington State and California and Chicago? They said, yes. He then leaned toward the microphone and said, help!
Well, the Negro has been subjected to this for over 100 years. We're now in what you call phase 2 of the revolution. Why hasn't this happened before? What is responsible for it coming up now in the 60s? Why has the Negro stayed down so long?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One reason was the Supreme Court decision of 1954 in the school desegregation cases, which set the legal framework for a real push to eliminate racial discrimination. For the first time in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court said that segregation is per se discrimination and is therefore unconstitutional. Other reasons are World War II, in which the Negro soldiers who were fighting were told that they were fighting against the master race theory of Nazism, and inevitably they began to ask themselves, what about the master race theory back home? So did their friends and relatives. A second reason is the increasing education of Negro youth. As the youngsters are going to school in larger numbers and studying the foundations of American democracy, where it says, for example, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created free and equal, inevitably they ask themselves, well, what about me? Don't these things mean me too? Third reason is Africa. As the new nations of Africa have begun to emerge, Negroes have looked to that continent with greater pride and have had more awareness of having come from something, having some roots, and therefore the ability to go somewhere.
A national pride. We have Afro-Americans.
That's right. Yes, many Negroes considering themselves Afro-Americans and being proud of being black rather than ashamed of their skin color, as had been true for a long period of time.
Do you think education is pretty much a key to Negro equality?
Education is very important, indeed. We have to define what we mean by education here. Many people say that the whole race problem will be solved by education. Well, what many of them mean then is we should do nothing else. We should have no action. We should have no Selmas, no Montgomerys, and so forth. But obviously it is true that there is a great gap between the education of Negroes and the education of whites because of the inferior segregated schools to which most Negroes have gone in the South and in northern cities as well. So it's now important for us to have a massive program of remedial education to repair the damage that has been done to our youngsters, Negro youngsters, Puerto Rican youngsters, Mexican-American youngsters, Indian youngsters, white youngsters in Appalachia and other areas who have been damaged by inferior education.
This gets down to the war on poverty, I think, doesn't it?
It does, indeed. It's my belief that it ought to be a major part of the anti-poverty program, and I've taken the occasion to talk with President Johnson several times about it. He's expressed great interest and has asked that we submit memoranda to him outlining how such a program could work. I have now sent 3 memoranda to the President on it, and we are hopeful that it will be incorporated into the anti-poverty program.
How significant is the new voting rights legislation that is being considered?
It will be very significant indeed, because there are several million Negroes who are disenfranchised in the South because of their race or their color, which means they are taxed without representation, which means that they have little or no voice in their political life and political destiny. If the voter rights bill is a strong one and is enacted into law without weakening amendments, then it will make a great political change in the South. What we'll find is that the politicians who are racists will either change their views or will be replaced.
This leads to the question, will the Negro try to replace all the white lawmakers with Negro lawmakers?
No, he will not. I see no evidence at all, no indication whatsoever that Negroes would vote out all whites and vote in only Negroes. I think they will vote out those persons who are opposed to civil rights and to equality. They will vote in persons, irrespective of their race or their color, who have the right point of view and are in favor of equality and democracy and decency.
Like a lobbying group, then, you exert pressure for those who see your philosophy.
Precisely. Negroes are more concerned with the point of view of the candidate than they are with the race of the candidate.
How do you feel about the voting rights legislation? Are you happy with it? Will it do the job totally?
Well, it is good legislation as it stands now, but it needs considerable strengthening in a number of ways. For example, the 50% provision. It now says that if less than 50% of the citizens of any state were registered last November or voted in the election, then the federal law becomes applicable and federal registrars are appointed. Well, that's not adequate because there are some states in the South, such as Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida, where more than 50% of the people were registered and did vote. Yet there are counties in those states where Negroes are discriminated against. I then suggest that we have a provision in the legislation which would allow 20 people who have been discriminated against in voting rights to petition the Department of Justice. And if the Department of Justice, after investigation, finds that there's justification for the complaint, then federal registrars should be sent in.
What about the legislation of understanding? We hear this argument frequently that you can pass all the laws in the world, but it isn't going to help one man understand another or treat him any better or think of him any differently.
Well, the law is a very great help, obviously. The law cannot keep a man from hating me. It may not make him love me, but it can keep him from lynching me, and that's terribly important as far as I'm concerned. Well, I think we need to understand that the law does not try to legislate the evil out of men's hearts. What it tries to do is to control men's practices so that whatever evil of prejudice exists within them is not allowed to damage other people. And this is a very important function. Now, legally, I would have a right to dislike a man. The law couldn't touch me. Legally, I'd have a right to hate him. I suppose I'd even have a right legally to wish him dead, but I wouldn't have a right legally to kill him. Then it's a function of the law to step in and say whatever evil is in your heart must not be allowed to damage this man.
Do you think this eventually, over the decades, will lead to softening of these opinions?
Well, I think it will. I think it will very much for two specific reasons. One reason that most people don't want to be law offenders. And if the law says that this is right, then most people will tend to comply with it. And the law in itself will convince them of its rightness. And second, we believe that if you can, by laws or by direct action or by negotiation, eliminate this practice of segregation, break down the barriers, that is, then at least people can come into contact and have an opportunity to develop friendships, to develop understanding. In other words, while it is true that prejudice produces segregation, it's also true that segregation produces and perpetuates prejudice by keeping people apart.
Have you seen any evidences of this theory since the Civil Rights Law was passed?
Why, yes. We have found that in the South, in cities in the Deep South, where they had said, no, never, we will never desegregate this restaurant or this theater, this lunch counter, or what have you. After the law went into effect, they did desegregate, and nothing has happened. The place is not burned down. There are no fist fights. People who sit down have found it irrelevant who is at a table behind them in a restaurant.
It's no longer important who sits across in the next table.
It's not important who sits there. I was in a hotel in Savannah, Georgia, which had been segregated before the Civil Rights Act, was now desegregated. There were about 50 Negroes there attending a conference. There were no problems whatever.
How do you think the Johnson administration is doing for the civil rights cause?
Well, I've been impressed with the Johnson administration and particularly with President Johnson in his sincerity and his interest in doing something about solving this problem. We felt that he was slow to move in the Selma crisis and should have moved earlier, which is the reason we built up pressure on him and set the thing right at his doorstep. But when he acted strongly. He spoke out strongly. He joined the civil rights movement, and he has declared war on the Ku Klux Klan, and that's been a long time coming.
Mr. Farmer, where is the Negro Revolution headed? We know that it's breaking wide open in the South. How about the North?
Well, for a long time, Northern Negroes were much more apathetic than Southern Negroes and did not have the same spirit in resisting. The reason being that conditions are relatively good. That is, they were better than in the South. Many Negroes who had come from the South to the North felt that they had escaped, and that the obvious discrimination, the for colored, for white signs, and the brutality did not exist. After they remained in the North for a while, however, they found that there were severe problems of job discrimination and housing discrimination and de facto school segregation, that is, school segregation based upon residential segregation. The Civil Rights Revolution thus began in the South. It began a few years ago with the sit-ins, the student sit-ins in the South, and the freedom rides, and so forth. Now it has spread north. You may recall that in the spring and summer of 1963, there were massive demonstrations, not only in the South, but also in the North. In the North, there were many large picket lines around construction sites, for example, protesting discrimination in the building trades and the construction industry. Likewise, there have been school boycotts in a number of cities in the North, protesting segregation in the schools.
Will this intensify in the coming year or the months ahead?
There's no question about it. The Civil Rights Revolution is now across the board, north, south, east, and west. And I think that this trend will continue until we have been victorious. And by victorious, I mean that America lives up to its promise and its aspirations of democracy. And we have really an open society, a society of friends, where what a person can do and what he can become is not restricted by the color of his skin.
Let me ask you, when do you foresee an end to the revolution?
Well, it's difficult to say how long it'll take because there's so many factors that we do not know and cannot judge. We don't know how intense will be the response of the federal government or the American people generally. But if I must give a wild guess, I would say that within the next 10 or 15 years, we should be over the hump, and the basic part of the job will be done.
Getting back to the North, we find a lot of communities in the North, especially, that say we have no race problem.
Yes.
Bellingham is a community that claims it has no race problem.
Well, yes, many communities say we have no race problem when what they really mean is they have no Negroes. If they have no Negroes or very few Negroes, then obviously there is no problem in the sense that there is no tension, there is no issue raised. But what they have found in many cases is that when the Negro population increases, as the migration from the South to the North goes on, that they do have a problem. Now, before World War II, there were many towns and cities, particularly in the Northwest, that had no Negro population, and thus boasted that they had no race problem. But during the war, Negroes came in for wartime jobs in industry, and for the first time they found that they did have a problem, because the Negroes who came in were segregated in living and were discriminated against in jobs, and they found that considerable racial tension existed.
The thought is still there, even though the physical manifestation has not taken place.
That is right. The thought is there and the prejudice is there. I think it's terribly important for all Americans to search their own hearts and to find out to what extent they share the prejudices that exist in other parts of the country, what their attitudes are toward Negroes, what image they have of Negroes, whether when they think of Negroes they think of an inferior people, whether they believe Negroes are inferior, whether they think of Negroes as being clowns or buffoons, such as we used to see very often in the movies, the Stephen Fetchits and so on.
The image,
the stereotyped image, or whether we think of Negroes as happy-go-lucky, contented people who sit under the magnolia trees in the South and strum their guitars and sing sweetly of the hereafter. If these are the images, then they are wrong.
Have our schools been partly at fault in creating that image? That textbook writers?
The schools have been very much at fault. The textbooks used in high schools and in colleges dealing with American history do not portray accurately the role and the contribution of Negroes to American history and the building of America. They present instead an image of Negroes during slavery as being generally acquiescent, people who accepted their role in slavery and made perfect slaves, ignoring the fact that there were slave revolts led by slaves, and that there was the Underground Railroad where slaves ran away from home to escape north at great risk to themselves. Not only the textbooks used in high schools and colleges, but also books used in elementary schools and preschool books used by smaller children frequently portray Negroes as carriers of bags, as porters exclusively, or as janitors who sweep and mop and scrub the floors. And this tends to plant the idea in the minds of the young, and they grow up then with the stereotyped image of Negroes.
Could the press be partly at fault here, the mass media?
Well, it is, I think, to a great extent. We find still in many cities that there are racial designations attached to crime stories. In other words, if a crime, small or large, is committed by a person who happens to be a Negro, then he is indicated, he is described as John Jones Negro. The same is not done with white persons who commit crimes. We don't say Anthony Smith of English descent, or Irish, or Scandinavian, or German, or Italian. We just give the name.
When we began this program, you were telling about an experience in Plaquemine, Louisiana. An experience that I think none of us had ever heard of, and I'm sure there must be thousands of other experiences every day, every week of this type. Is the press doing its job in this respect? In other words, we read reports, we see television reports, where there are killings, where there are mass demonstrations. But what about the deprivation of rights that are not being reported?
Well, there are, as you indicate, many such instances of brutality, of denial of human rights, and they occur daily in the Deep South. They do not come to the attention of the public. The press does not cover them unless there has been a death or great beatings, violence of that sort, or mass arrests. Most of the incidents go unnoticed indeed. Selma, for example, would not have gotten the attention which it did get had it not been for the masses of people who were in the street and for the arrest of Dr. King and for the brutality that the state police and the sheriff's deputies used against Negroes when they attempted to march to Montgomery on that first Sunday.
Would the revolution be as effective, or the civil rights movement be as effective as it is, had you not received the press coverage you have received, however?
Obviously it would not. I think that television particularly has been helpful. The student sit-ins in the South in 1960, for example, would not have spread in all probability as they did had it not been for the television coverage which they received. Many youngsters in other parts of the South saw on the television screen what their co-partners were doing in other parts of the South and asked themselves, and why shouldn't we do the same? Then they hit the streets and began demonstrating. So television helped it to spread, and it has helped people all over the country to realize the depths of the problem and the intensity of the feeling, and thus their consciences have been stirred and their intellects enlivened.
Tell us a little bit about CORE, Mr. Farmer. Direct action, nonviolence, something that, what makes you willing to put your life on the line?
Well, CORE is an organization dedicated to nonviolent direct action. It was founded in 1942, and I'm proud to say I was one of the founders of it many years ago. And it's an interracial organization, national in scope, which uses techniques such as those that were developed by Gandhi in India as the Indians fought for an end to colonialism and for self-determination. Now, it is our conviction that if a person is opposed to an evil, such as racial segregation or discrimination, he has a responsibility to try to withdraw himself from participation in that evil and to try to bring the evil to an end. This means, in other words, that he has a responsibility to place his body between the evil practice and the perpetrators of the evil, and thus try to stop the practice of the evil. Now, all of us are afraid, of course. We would be lying if we said that when we go to Selma, when we go to Montgomery, when we face a lynch mob, we are not frightened. We are frightened, but there is a determination which outweighs that fear, a determination to do something against the problem that completely submerges the fear.
What does a cattle prod feel like?
Well, it gives you quite a shock. It's an instrument about so long that is battery operated and transistorized, and when it touches the skin, it gives you quite a shock. It is used to move cattle normally. Balky cattle are stuck with it, and they will move. Now, when a human being is stuck with it, he gets an equal shock, and he will move too. It is not dangerous in the sense that it won't kill you unless you have a bad heart.
Welcome back. Again, hopefully you enjoyed the clips. Even if you didn't enjoy the clips, I hope it got to the point that it causes you to think and causes you to ask questions. And hopefully I didn't offend anybody with that 2-minute PSA on homelessness, because unfortunately a lot of people don't want to look at homelessness, but it's there. So again, I'll see you next week, but until then, I'll be on the long road, and have a good week. Thank you.